If I had a hammer, I'd hammer in the morning, I'd hammer in the evening, all over this land. I'd hammer out danger, I'd hammer out a warning, I'd hammer out love.
It's not that one, it's the next one. That's a dummy one. That's the one that should be playing in it. Yeah. Okay, let me just start. We should do attendance. We'll wait till I'll do it on Monday probably. Well, unfortunately, the music on the PowerPoint does not. I've not seemed to master that piece of the technology yet for some reason. You can see it's telling us to play and it's not playing. I'll tell you what it was to play later as a point of introduction. I've downloaded some slides that we missed when the PowerPoint wasn't working 2 times ago. But let me just cover. This is from fragment game 3. This was fragment A, which was the facade of St. Anne's Church. The NYU dorm behind it, initially constructed in 1847 as the 12th Street Baptist Church. Later served as Temple Emmanuel. Again, many of these have been consecrated spaces that have gone through various lifetimes. NYU, again, one of the interesting examples of an effort to try to preserve something of the historic past by maintaining the facade, even though indeed the church itself has been torn down. Fragment B was the interior from the Jaffe Art Theater, which is now the Village East Cinema on most of you know, on 2nd Avenue. It was initially part of the Yiddish Art Theater and part of the interior. And if you go into the theater, you'll see much of this kind of decorative art from the Yiddish Art Theater. Fragment C, which was the Stuyvesant Polytechnic Hospital on 2nd Avenue, between St. Mark's Place and East 9th Street from 1883 to 1884. Originally the German dispensary. The busts of the physicians at the top are Harvey, Linné, Humboldt, Lavoisier, and Huitlan. Some of you. This was fragment 4, the old church house at 50 East 7th Street. It's the rectory of the Middle Collegiate Church, which is on the corner of 2nd Avenue. The church itself is quite interesting. If you go into it, it has original Tiffany windows that some of you would see. It's a neo-Romanesque church. The IT Company, 4th Avenue, the southeast corner of 12th Street. The J.L. Taylor and Company, men's suits. Presently, art supplies downstairs, some of you have seen, and a co-op that doesn't allow students, as I recall. Some of you all thought that was of interest. And the last and easiest one, of course, for many of you, St. Anne's Parochial School, between 3rd and 4th Street. Later, the Delahanty Institute, and now apartments next door to Webster Hall. Some of you wondered why anyone would want to live next to Webster Hall as a residence. Of course, easy to get right online and go right in and see all your gigs. So there you are. They got a series of very good submissions on this, all of which will be duly credited. The winner was one that also added some quite terrific fragments, I thought. One was simply the founding stone from Henry Morgenthau Jr., etc., the fragment of Cooper Square Post Office. So it's a quite good kind of fragment that allows you, rather than showing the whole building. And the one that I thought was particularly good, a fragment from the New York Ear and Eye Infirmary between 2nd Avenue and 13th and 14th Street, Abraham Du Bois Pavilion. Again, just a small piece that one gets to see. The winner was Adriana Mazzai, right in front. Congratulations. This is game four, the Soho game. There are only 5 fragments in this game, easy game. It's Soho. This was fragment 1. It's been up on Blackboard, but this is the one you couldn't see because the PowerPoint didn't work that day. So I've added this for you to see today. Okay. This was fragment 2 that I showed you last time. Okay, one of the grand cast iron buildings that are signature buildings, architectural styles for Soho. This was from the lecture that we missed. Remember I told you about a dumbbell tenement. Now remember, initially these tenements there would be another tenement here, and this area would not have been indented. So there would be a wall straight across here, so there would be no windows. When the dumbbell tenement was created, you can see it's indented here. It shapes like a dumbbell in a gym, with two, where the weights would be on either end. By indenting it allows you to have windows, interior windows, to the apartments on the inside. So that's what I wanted. I thought rather hopelessly to illustrate last time, so I thought it would be useful for you to actually see a dumbbell tenement. Now you see there would be another building still here, but it too would be indented. What you'd have here is a long donut hole that goes all the way to the bottom, and I remember I said to you, you'd be in your windows on the 3rd, 4th, and 5th floor. Anything that would be thrown out goes all the way to the bottom, creates, if there's a fire, a kind of chimney draft. So it wasn't always the most sanitary or the safest kind of embellishment, but it did provide interior light for the various windows in the tenement house law. The other piece I showed you were Jacob Riis photos, and I wanted to suggest to you again how, rather than just documenting the poor, these were staged photos in which he really tried to evoke very particular kinds of images of kind of pathos about the poor, kind of stylized and caricatured images. So I just thought you'd appreciate seeing some of Jacob Riis's very famous photos that he took from a book that he published called How the Other Half Lives. And now we'll proceed. The music that you were going to hear today, if things had worked as they were expected, was a piece of music called the Hammer Song. It's some of you, I'm presuming, would have known it. It was at the top of the hit parade in 1962. If I Had a Hammer. Any of you know that song? It was sung by Peter, Paul, and Mary. There's a reggae version. There were versions appeared in Paris, appeared in France, that's to say, in London. It was recorded by upwards to 20 to 30 different artists. If I had a hammer, I'd hammer in the morning. I'd hammer out justice. I'd hammer out a warning. I'd hammer out love between my brothers and my sisters all over this land. If I had a bell, I'd ring it in the morning. If I had a song, I'd sing it in the morning. So it was about a hammer, a bell, and a song. It's the hammer of justice, the bell of freedom, and a song about love between my brothers and my sisters all over this land. Another time, if I'm in voice, I'll sing it for you. But that's the song. The interesting thing about the song is that while it was at the top of the hit parade in 1962, it was sung in, the recording you were going to hear was from Carnegie Hall in 1963, where it was sung by the group that actually performed it for the first time, and they were called the Weavers. And it was a reunion of the Weavers singing at Carnegie Hall in 1963. Any of you know of the Weavers? Well, the lead singer you probably might know. His name was Pete Seeger. Does that name ring a bell with any of you? A few more? Okay. The song was performed for the first time in 1949 at a rally by the Weavers on behalf of 11 people who were being tried for being communists. And it was part of the purge of communists at a time when, if you were a member of the Ku Klux Klan, for instance, or some kind of right-wing militia group, that was perfectly legal, but free speech was declared not to extend to people who were members of the Communist Party during that particular period. And so it provoked a good deal of dissent, but it was very effective, as you'll see, in getting the communists out of a whole series of organizations in which they had played a prominent role, some of which we suggested in the 30s. So if last time was a lecture on what I called the making of the socialist municipality of New York City, this is about Cold War New York, and it's about the beginnings of the evisceration, the eating away of some of those kinds of programs and gains. At the end of the 1930s, New York City was a labor town with strong left-wing unions, but during the war, the unions that had been stimulated and led by members or people who were sympathetic to the communist movement took on a no-strike pledge during the war. in good part because they were often in lockstep with the leadership, at least, with what was going on in the Soviet Union, which was their model for what they thought would be the brave new world. And since Russia was now an ally of the United States, they believed that, in fact, everything that could be done on behalf of the United States war effort was also a way of supporting the creation of a socialist state in Russia that they hoped would be a model for a socialist state in the United States. However, that often alienated many people in the labor movement because they were being told if you had grievances, you should put them aside and you should not strike during this period. The federal government controlled wages and prices with a war labor board, and wages began to stagnate during much of the period during the war. So there were a lot of pent-up grievances, even though indeed there were strikes. But with the end of the war, these pent-up grievances were ignited by soldiers who were also returning home expecting jobs. They were expecting also a new standard of living. They presumed that the effort that had gone into building a wartime economy would now be transferred into peacetime uses with new consumer goods, that instead of making tanks, we'd make washing machines, we'd make dryers, we'd make dishwashers, we'd make vacuum cleaners. And indeed, that was done. And it's argued by many people that the 1950s was the decade that helped to mark America as really almost the decade became known as the century of America because of the new standard of living that Americans achieve generally. A standard of living that is shared by all Americans with one profound exception, and that was African Americans. That's to say, the new affluence did not extend largely to people of color. And it's worth noting that this is a decade, however, in which cities, and strikingly this city, become, to use a term, blackened. That's to say, there's an increasingly large percentage of the population of the city which is made up of African Americans, Afro-Caribbeans, and Latinos who were also self-identified or identified by others as black, people coming from Puerto Rico in large numbers. That, of course, was intensive. Federal government, 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 alienate, 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 federal government, federal government, federal government, home expect, home expect, home expect, transfer, 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 the almost that transfer Alienate. Cardinal Spellman writes, I admit to the accusation of strikebreaker. This is again an article from Time magazine report, said the Cardinal Archbishop of New York, Francis J. Spellman, and I'm proud of it. If stopping a strike like this isn't a thing of honor, then I don't know what an honor is. For 3 days last week, Cardinal Spellman walked about the 550-acre expanse of crowded Calvary Cemetery in New York City's Queens, supervising his corps of 100 amateur gravediggers. All of them were young students for the priesthood, recruits from St. Joseph's Seminary in Yonkers, New York. Cardinal Spellman's troubles as an employer of labor began in January. The 200-odd union workers of Calvary, one of the country's largest Roman Catholic cemeteries, were bargaining for a raise of about 20%, a 5-day week for the same wages they now get for a 6-day week. So that was the reduction from 48 to 40 hours. Their employers, the trustees of Manhattan St. Patrick's Cathedral, offered them a raise of about 3%. The gravediggers turned the offer down and negotiations came to a stop. On January 13th, they went out on strike and coffins began to pile up. After burial services, the coffins were laid in shallow uncovered trenches, and last week, when the number of unburied dead topped 1,000, the cardinal called out his seminarians. So basically, the seminarians became strikebreakers in this. He's arguing that it's an honor not just because of the issue around the dead, but he goes on to point out, of course, because he argues that this is a strike led by communists, that the labor movement is a communist-led labor movement. In the rank, he has waiting in his wings an alternative AFL anti-communist affiliate with which, as soon as he breaks the strike, Cardinal Spellman agrees immediately to negotiate with them for exactly the same terms, and he settles the strike amicably. So the irony is that Spellman settles the strike, but only when he agrees not to negotiate the strike with the communist-led union. He negotiates the exact same strike with an AFL affiliate, which is anti-communist. Now, lest you think these are singular movements in which all the Catholics are anti-communist, it should be reminded, none of these stories are so simple. There were Catholics who were very active in the communist movement and very active in movements for social justice. We talked about Michael Quill last time, the Transit Workers Union. We could also talk about Dorothy Day, who edits The Catholic Worker. Both Quill, Vito Marcantonio, one of the assemblymen, a socialist and communist associated or allied legislators, actually he's a congressman in New York City, while he never joins the Communist Party, were friendly to the kind of principles and worked with the rank and file in the Communist Party. So there were lots of people who were Catholics who also were on the right, others who were on the left. Most, the predominant number, the predominant tradition, of course, because they wanted to follow the teachings of the church, tended to be on the right, but people like Dorothy Day, writing in The Catholic Worker, who was herself active in seminarian, also was part of a left-wing church movement that always existed as well within the church during this period.
Would you say, so the AFL was anti-communist, was the CIO a communist?
The CIO unions in New York in particular had been largely built with communist leadership. The rank and file was not always communist, but they were the people who had helped to organize those leaders had often been people who were either associated with the communist movement, some were active in it. The point mostly is they supported the principles of the communist movement in labor in particular. That's to say, not about Russia per se, but certainly about militants about issues around wages and issues. They tended to be a more militant set of union leaders on this issue. The response in 1947 is that New York State passes the Wilson-Pakula Law, P-A-K-U-L-A, Wilson-Pakula Law, with both Democrats and Republicans together supporting it, which forbids candidates from entering primaries without support of the party's national leadership. This was really an effort to target Vito Marcantonio, who was getting the support of his local leadership. It was a way, frankly, with Democrats and Republicans, ending the support of proportional representation or third-party movements. What they wanted to do was to ensure that only people with the support of either the Republican Party or the Democratic Party could enter the Democratic or Republican primary. What was happening instead is that people like Marcantonio, without the support of the Democratic Party, were entering those primaries and then winning the election, even though they were also running on the American Labor Party or on the Socialist Party or with the Communist Party support. And now they're saying you can only run on the Democratic Party if, in fact, the Democratic Party in some way endorses you, the leadership supports you in the national level. And it was a way to try to deny them any of the votes on that part of the ticket. What it effectively did from 47 and 48 forward, just so you have a sense of this, is it meant that for the next half century, the city council in New York City would be virtually entirely Democratic. There would be virtually no third-party candidates on the city council. There would effectively end any minority voice on the national level, on the city level, outside of the two-party system. On the national level, the actions were more draconian, but they took place with particular effect in New York City. First and foremost was 1947, the passage of what was known as the Taft-Hartley Act. Congress passed this as a revision. Now, remember, Congress is now Republican, not just Democratic, led by Republicans. It passes this to revise the Wagner Act. Remember, the Wagner Act had put in place the National Labor Relations Board. It had put in place a series of acts that had broadened the sense of entitlement, it had tried to open up possibilities, at least, for labor to have a voice in arbitration and negotiation and in appealing for legitimizing votes. Taft-Hartley is an effort to rebalance the Wagner Act back in support of at least some business interests. The major provisions were that it outlawed closed shops. According to a closed shop, if the majority voted to be a union, everyone had to join the union. Now they're saying, what they're saying here with law is that there can in fact be an active anti-communist element within the union that can fight against it. And needless to say, the bosses wanted that provision there because they wanted to do what they could to encourage those people and discourage people who were taking a position that was more militant. Most importantly, however, it required all union officers, this was the important provision, to file affidavits that they did not belong to the Communist Party or believe in the overthrow of government by force or illegal means. Now, mind you, no one in the Democratic Party had to sign such a thing, or in the Republican Party had to sign such a thing, so this was deeply controversial. Truman vetoes it as a consequence. But Congress, with wide business support, overrides the veto and it's put in place. It will ultimately lead to the dismembering of 11 national CIO unions whose leaders are jailed or fired, and they're all replaced with anti-communist leadership, sometimes in new CIO unions without that leadership, and often with new AFL affiliates. They are all the national unions that we talked about in New York that play a major role in New York City.
Professor,
yes, please.
Is that the reason why all professors and teachers at NYU has to sign that document?
It's a vestige of that, yes, it's actually a vestige from the 50s. That's right. In 1947, New York State passes what's known as the Conlin-Wadlin Act. Conlin is C-O-N-L-I-N, and Wadlin is W-A-D-L-I-N. You put a dash between. The Conlin-Wadlin Act. The key is it forbids strikes by public employees. It's put in place. There's a transit strike, range of strikes. The key to note is that it's in place arguing that everyone else can strike, but you can't strike if you're a public employee and you'll be put in jail. Worth noting that they go out on strike all the time anyway, and they virtually are always let off because of public support and because these unions are very powerful. And so the law is changed in 1967. It becomes known as the Taylor Law because of a Columbia University, University of Pennsylvania historian who wrote a book called The Transportation Revolution named Taylor, who becomes the head of an arbitration panel created by Rockefeller, and he puts this new law in place. I mention that mostly for the graduate students who are interested in history. Okay. That's the Taylor Law, and it's put in place. It also has almost no effect. The first time, actually, that it's virtually ever used to jail anyone is after the transit strike only about 5 years ago. So for the next half century, these laws are in place, Conlin-Wadlin and Taylor, and what they mostly have is a chilling effect on labor. To argue that if you're a public employee, you run the risk of being jailed. And indeed, Michael Quill, by the way, was jailed and leads the strike from his hospital bed after that. But mostly a chilling effect for most of this period. What happens instead, of course, is what we know as McCarthyism, led first and foremost by the House Un-American Activities Committee on the House level and Senator McCarthy on the senatorial level. The House Un-American Activities Committee might well have just been called something like the Nixon Committee. He was the person who really gave most of it its teeth in the late 40s, and that's where he got his reputation from it. HUAC, as it was called, the House Un-American Activities Committee, and McCarthy campaigns put out blacklists. Anyone whose name appeared on a list would immediately lose their job. Anyone associated with any left parties in the past, when they were legal, by the way, when there was rights to assembly and free speech, anyone who was suspected of deviant behavior, which meant gay people often, or anybody who was thought to be gay, unless you were the head of the lawyer for the McCarthy Committee, in which case you got away with it, was called and expected to name names. The people who came up, testified, often cited the First or the Fifth Amendment, as refused to testify, as incriminating free speech, but were all declared to be guilty. It meant effectively that all of these people either were jailed, went underground, lost their jobs, and it decimated the leadership of the unions and teachers and social work. 300 teachers in New York City were fired. Those who weren't fired certainly knew that it was not appropriate to talk about doing things like going out on strike. It was not thought to be too appropriate to identify too much with black children, because that was, after all, the kind of appeal that only communists made. Virtually all, however, it's worth noting, were Jewish teachers. Predominant number were Jewish teachers. Though the Jewish community as a whole was quiet about the issue, because the Jewish community didn't want to associate with Jews who were being stigmatized as communists. So the Jewish community, the established Jewish community, often was as anti-communist as others were, because they didn't want to be associated with Jews who were being stigmatized as communists. It was as divided as the Catholic community, even as Jews and Catholics often were on opposite sides. There were not very many Catholics in the communist movement. Jews were increasingly defensive because of things like the Rosenberg case, Ethel and Julius Rosenberg, who were identified as Jews. And that led, to give you an example of the complicated politics of identity, the judge was Irving Kaufman, who was also Jewish, was brought in to try them, and goes out of his way to demonstrate that Jews were not to be associated with communism by demonstrating he could be tougher on them than anybody else, and so he becomes effectively a hanging judge, ruling against them for stealing A-bomb secrets. We know now, even though all the scientists at the time testified that there was effectively no secret to be stolen, everything that was involved was pretty much known, but espionage was a different matter, and we actually do know now that it was likely that Julius, but not Ethel, did transmit information, though we know it was probably information that was already well known. So they were a spy, they weren't saying anything that was new, and one wasn't a spy, but they were lumped together in part because it becomes complicated, this kind of ethnic politics about the Jews being associated with communists. I'll be a tougher Jew to demonstrate Jews aren't all like that. It's the complicated story that we've talked about before. Taft-Hartley was the biggest weapon in dismantling the unions. At the end of World War II, the CIO and the communists and their allies dominated the leadership. To give you a sense, these are unions that are particularly active in New York City. The electrical workers, the transit workers, the National Maritime Union, the great building in Chelsea that you would see on 10th Avenue and 17th Street. The furriers, the Union of Office and Professional Workers Association, that included the social workers in the private unions, like at Federation of Jewish Philanthropies. The Union of Public Workers, those were the people who were in the welfare department, public workers. The shoe workers, the furniture workers, the American Communication Association, the department store locals, the Teachers Union, and the CIO Greater New York Industrial Union Council. By 1949, all are decertified by the federal government as being communist-led. So you can hear that to the extent to which they had played a role in stimulating, providing leadership to a labor movement that gave New York City part of its character, New York City becomes also decertified. It tries to change that role and undermine it by effectively eviscerating that leadership in this national legislation. All of these unions are effectively replaced by anti-communist leaders or AFL alternatives waiting in the wings. Michael Quill even defects. He remains in charge, but he defects from the left, realizing that the anti-communism, as a Catholic, was in fact going to stigmatize or make difficult his alliance with Irish members of his union, and that as a power, if he's going to hold power, he had to be willing to broaden his appeal. Two stories give us a sense of the later impact in New York City of this shift on New York City social history. One is about teachers, and the second is about social workers. Teacher unionization. Teachers were always paid low work. Were always low paid for their work. Let me get my sentences out. They had demoralizing work conditions. In 1900, the average salary nationwide of $500 for a teacher in New York was less than what a factory laborer might have gotten. The New York City average was actually $720, was less than a firefighter or a policeman, in good part because a firefighter and a policeman were male. Teachers were female. So the gendered character of labor also affected the wage and treatment of these people. Classes averaged 40. School authorities were also men, and they held patronizing attitudes toward mostly women teachers, who by and large, by the way, were not expected to marry. That was thought, in fact, to be inappropriate and dangerous and a bad example, and they were expected to leave if they got married. As late as 1904, women teachers were inspected by the superintendent in New York to make sure they weren't pregnant. I'm not quite sure what that inspection was like. I presume it was an external inspection. But they were suspended for, quote, gross misconduct if they were married. Okay. Their response was to unionize. In 1911, they formed an International Association of Teachers, and they lobbied New York State for more pay. But that was a single-issue movement. They wanted more pay, they got it, and they disbanded. In the next few years, the Organization of Chicago's Teachers inspires a New York City socialist by the name of Henry Linville in 1913 to form the New York Teachers Union. And by 1916, it becomes what we know as the TU, the Teachers Union, Local 5 of the AFL. You noticed, however, his name was Henry. The teachers are mostly female, but it was appropriate. We let a man lead the union. So it is a male-led union of women teachers. It is socialist, male-led, and it is part of a Jewish AFL union, largely Jewish. In the 30s, the union starts to accept some of the wage cuts that were affecting every workforce. And communists in the city convinced members that they should attack Linville's passive approach as not in the best interest of the labor force, and the left wins control of the union. And they throw out Linville. And however, it begins to put in place 3 decades of factionalism in the union movement of teachers. The irony, of course, is Linville had in fact celebrated the Russian Revolution. He had been a radical in the teens. He had celebrated on the front page of the American Teacher, the local newspaper. And the Board of Education had condemned him for sharing a platform with the leader of the American Communist movement, William Z. Foster, and had accused him of having excessive left-wing politics. But while he had been accused of being excessively left-wing in the 20s, by the 30s, he's not left-wing enough for the new communist leaders. 1933, major leader, educational leader in New York City is John Dewey, Columbia University, educational philosopher, and an early ally of Linville, and he chairs a fact-finding committee about the union to find out what's actually going on in the union, which side is right. Is it Linville or is it the communist rank and file who are opposing him? And he calls for the suspension of the communist members. That's to say, he leads through him a purge of the Reds in the union by the socialists, ironically in an institution committed to free speech, an educational institution. So there are all kinds of ironies. The teachers, supposedly all talking about free speech, are fighting one another over whose speech is right and all of this. And well before McCarthyism. So he votes to suspend them, but in the vote they failed to get a 2/3 vote. So Linville has to appeal to a national union to purge the radical minority, and the radical union led by a man named William Green, who is the president of the American Federation of Labor, pressures the leaders to expel them, but the membership balks. So Linville and another male leader, another socialist leader, lead 800 members out of the teachers' union, and they form an alternative to the teachers' union, which now becomes communist-led union, and they form something called the Teachers Guild. So from the mid-30s onward, we have a teachers' guild led by Linville and these men who had earlier formed the teachers' union. The teachers' union now is a more militant group led by communists and others in the union. They're activists. They support, and one of the provisions of their activism, to give you a sense of what the difference would have meant, is that is not unlike the difference between the AFL and the CIO. Whereas the AFL tended to support just craft unionists, and the CIO often supported a broader range of less skilled workers, the radical union, the teachers' union now, supports substitute workers to become members of their union. Why would they do so? Why would they want to support substitutes? What would be the sense in doing that? Any idea?
So that they wouldn't be strike breakers?
Yeah, so they wouldn't be alternative strike breakers. Bring them into the union, broadens your base, and they don't serve as an alternative or reserve army of cheap labor to be brought in to displace you. So they support the substitutes, and especially a group of people who they argued had become, quote, permanent substitutes with lower pay and no benefits. We have them here. We call them perma-temps. We call them an adjuncts union, or we call them faculty fellows at the university. And their membership, the membership of the union swells to 7,500, becomes a very big union. By 1939, the teachers' union tries to get the AFT to join the CIO as an industrial and more militant union, but is unable to do so because of the Hitler-Stalin Pact. Local 5, this militant teachers' union, is ultimately ousted from the Federation of Teachers and replaced by the Teachers Guild. Local 5 joins the CIO as part of the United Public Workers. Remember, I mentioned that was one of the radical unions. So what we effectively have is constant purges of these radicals, socialists basically fighting communists. That's who they are. The other teachers group, mostly male-led socialists. The other union has a much larger, for the first time, female leadership, tends to be more radical, more broad-based, and is being forced out of the more mainstream movement, and it joins the CIO unions during this period. During the 46 strike wave, the Guild becomes part of the anti-communist attacks on the teachers' union. In its own words, quote, to eliminate subversives from the school system. Indeed, it should be noted that the attack the story has actually profound has profound effects that reflected what we would call the politics of ethno-religion or ethno-religious differences in New York City, in particular between Jews and Catholics. And it will be a profound division that will occur for the next 20 years, in part because increasingly Catholics are involved in an alternative Catholic school system that's outside the public school system. And Jews are increasingly inside the public school system where these radicals are. It becomes galvanized in particular through much of this period because of the case of a Catholic teacher by the name of Mary Quinn, who is a Holocaust denier in the public school system and is accused of making anti-Semitic comments, which enraged New York City Jews. They press the Board of Education to suspend her, and Catholics argue this is actually a Jewish attack on Catholics. They see this part of the Jewish communist conspiracy against Catholic leadership that has already been seen as part of the Catholic attack on communists. So she is suspended, but very briefly, and put back to work. But what the case illustrates for us is the ways in which religion now and ethnicity are complicating political divisions and political conflict in New York City, and in particular around education. And this, you'll see, will come up in 1967 and 68 again in the school system. In 1950, the teachers' union is barred from meeting with all school officials and purged from any active role in schools. And in fact, it's the Guild, after the UPW, the United Public Workers, and the teachers' union are effectively dismantled, that comes to represent the teachers. What, however, of social workers is the other piece that I want to use to illustrate for you. The United Public Workers that I've mentioned that the teachers, radical teachers, became a part of, was also home to the Union of Social Workers in the public sector, meaning the welfare offices. Social workers led complicated lives. They have to decide, am I a professional or am I a worker? And so sometimes they professionalize as alternative to unionizing, and sometimes they do both. In New York City, they often did both. And they organized in the 1930s when conditions were pretty terrible, especially in this new sector of public works that didn't exist as a very large area. Most work prior to this had been in charity services, but charity couldn't keep up with the demands of the Depression. It just was incapable of having the resources to deal with 1 out of every 3 New Yorkers out of work. So the public sector becomes much more substantial, and it requires a much larger labor force of people to service it. People are dependent on relief, and the new public workers find their load very heavy and their pay very light. So they organize initially into the state, county, municipal workers of New York with the core of the New York Welfare Department. They, in 1946, merge with United Public Workers. So they become part of this public worker union. And they become part of the largest public worker union, local number 1 it was called, with 5,000 workers in New York City with members. They're organized by a man whose papers are here at NYU, named Abe Flaxer, who is a local New York person. Again, if you hear from that name, a Jewish labor organizer. Now, it should be noted that private social workers also unionized, and especially in the Federation of Jewish Philanthropy. So again, we have an ethnic story to all of this character. They are fought, it should be noted, by their bosses in Federation of Jewish Philanthropies, who are rich German Jews, who are not at all happy with them unionizing because these same workers have wives and daughters who are department store workers, where they're also unionizing. And these owners, the chairs of the boards of these Federation agencies are German Jews who also are the owners of the department stores. They're the owners of the garment factories, where they're employing the Jewish workers who work in the department stores and the garment factories. So it's, again, Eastern European Jews being associated with radicalism, going out on strike against German social workers, German Jews who are the heads of these agencies, the heads of the factories, the heads of the department stores, and want to make clear to the rest of the community that they are more respectable in controlling this out of control in their mind Jewish left in the labor movement. On the independent side, in the private sector, groups like Jewish Board of Guardians, Jewish Family Services, they become members of the Union of Office and Professional Workers. And what's unusual again about that union, again reflecting a CIO union, it is a union of professionals that includes clericals, maintenance workers, and social workers all in one union. So it's organized by the workplace, not by craft. That made it, again, a radical form of organization. And by 1940, they had won written contracts in 25 social service agencies. Again, as I've suggested, these contracts are won, but they stimulate ethno-religious conflict among these wealthy German Jews. People like Lewison, Lieb, Guggenheim, Jacob Proskauer. The Proskauer family, by the way, are the lawyers that NYU uses when it wants to break unions. It's still the leading Jewish labor-busting firm in New York City, so it has this legacy from the 30s forward doing these kinds of things. It's not a matter of liking it or not, that's just who they are. They do very well, I'm sure. They are, there are a series of strikes that these unions lead. They're at some hospitals. They create a lot of anxiety within the public sector. And you can imagine that as a consequence, there are many people in the public sector who are in support that there ought to be laws like the Conlon-Wadlin Act or the Taylor Law that ought to have limits on what these people do. The anti-communist purge of the CIO unions includes the purge of these social worker unions, but it has real effect on the day-to-day life of New Yorkers. It first of all finds ready allies in the city welfare department and federation, where Jews want to prove their loyalty against feared anti-Semitism to support anti-communism. And in both cases, anti-communist unions are waiting in the wings to displace these left-wing unions. So there are unions that remain in both of these organizations, the public and private sector, but they become anti-communist unions. In New York City, on the public sector, this is all mobilized by the Herlins investigation, a state committee, which is organized to look into the CIO for political affiliations. The commissioner defends workers as best he can, but he has to defend the placement that the newspapers report of 37 families out of, with 120 members, out of 233,000. So 120 people were found being placed in hotels. And a couple of newspapers picked this up and run notions that this is scandalous, that welfare people are being put in hotels. Later, of course, we'll call them welfare hotels. Ironically, it should be noted they were being put there not by the Department of Welfare, but they've been put there by Catholic Charities. But nonetheless, this becomes a public attack now on what are thought to be scandalous behavior of the public sector. In addition, there's a second story of a, quote, certain woman in mink with a $60,000 income who is given $7.50 a night, supposedly, for housing. A new commissioner is brought in to take over, and he attacks what he calls the liberal philosophy in the welfare department that has led to scandal. He believes the problem is social work schools, which are run, he argues, too much by left-wingers that are teaching people to be too lenient toward clients. The central problem, he argues, are communist philosophy that dominates relief, that is too sympathetic to the poor and is not professional, that a truly professional mentality is objective and not sympathetic. It is basically male and not female, that women, in fact, argue have a hard time being good professionals and social workers because women are taught to be sympathetic. They have to be taught to act like men, to be hard-nosed. O'Dwyer brings in a man by the name of William Hilliard from Illinois to, quote, clean up welfare in March of '48. He has a gender critique to begin with and sends a series of magazines, newspapers. Everyone is expected to be trained by a new welfare department in which they need to be retrained as Nellie the investigator. In the first one up on the left, Nellie says, I guess I'll do some dictation. On the right, she says, darn, I forgot my field book. Then here she's just scattermined, throwing her papers all over the place. Where the dickens are the notes on my pending, she says. Gosh, I can't do that now. I forgot that the medical social worker wants to see me, and I haven't reviewed the case. And the motto, organization saves time. The key is what's right and what's wrong with Nellie. The point was to retrain all of you hopeless little Nellies to become efficient, to become not unlike the lessons that had earlier been learned in Taylorism, no longer the Taylor law, the different Taylor, but to become efficient kind of people. And the objective was retraining these people to get them to appreciate their role. In the purging of these people, they're sent to what was thought to be Siberia. It was actually Brooklyn, thought to be an outpost where they would have to bide their time. And instead they recognized Local 371 of the Government Civil Employees Union, conservative union waiting in the wings. Hilliard rationalizes welfare with this kind of efficiency, and they start bean counting of welfare cases. The focus becomes on a new productivity mania in the welfare department, in which production is found by making sure that people are not hiding men under their beds. And that becomes the model for welfare in the 30s. The focus image, the famous image that they have in the 50s, that welfare becomes a reduction substantially in the number of welfare clients in the 50s in New York City from what it had been before. In addition, it means teaching them to behave properly. And while as in the earlier union they had been going out on May Day parades, the welfare department is now told that they must march not on May Day, but instead they have to march starting in 1948 in what is called Loyalty Day, a day that is started by Cardinal Spellman. In May Day, instead on Loyalty Day, the women are in front now, as it were, strutting their gender, while the men unencumbered behind them, who are their bosses, strut to show themselves off. May Day will be replaced by Flag Day and Loyalty Days generally. It's a kind of new gender traditionalism, not class politics, but the gendered politics. And the final piece of this, of course, was the development of something that had been Negro Week that the communists had put in place. And this shows instead, in 1950, a newly orchestrated Negro Week at Hunter College, arguing that previously it had been run by left-wingers. The Commissioner Hilliard appoints a woman to screen all the participants and instead put in the crowd black men and white men whom she could trust as being respectable anti-communists in their loyalty. The story I was going to end with was a chilling effect that this conflict has in the Purge. It was going to end actually with the most famous of these cases, which is the film On the Waterfront, which involves, in fact, the price that one pays for being a stool, and tries to celebrate, in fact, that because the director, in fact, was somebody who had been on the left and comes in and names names before the McCarthy committee. And so instead he makes a film in which he tries to demonstrate that, in fact, true loyalty is, in fact, standing up and naming names. And to make it clear that no one will be opposed to this, he makes the story one not of communism, but of corruption in the dockyards. What he ignores is, in fact, is that on the dockyards, what is profoundly happening at this time was not corruption, it was containerization that was wiping out all their jobs. And so what is the real story of the 1950s is the profound transformation of work that's taking place all throughout New York City as the first stirrings of deindustrialization will begin to change the political economy of New York. It's occurring at the very moment when the left wing that had led a labor movement in fighting the reorganization of work is no longer there to either understand or respond to those transformations in work. We'll talk about those transformations next time.